Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the February 2022 meeting of the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children. I'm Dr. Cynthia Powell, Committee Chair. We will begin with taking the roll. For committee members representing the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, Kamala Mistry.
Here.
Kyle Brothers, committee member. Here. I'm sorry if you could mute unless you're answering the roll call. Jane DeLuca.
Here.
From the CDC, Carla Cuthbert.
I'm here.
From the FDA, Kelly Kelm.
Here.
From Health Resources and Services Administration, Michael Warren.
Here.
Jennifer Kwan.
Here.
Sean McCandless.
Here.
From the National Institutes of Health, Melissa Parisi.
Here.
Shanika Ponpitcoon.
Here.
And Cynthia Powell, I'm here, and Scott Schoen.
Here.
Thank you. And now for our organizational representatives from the American Academy of Family Physicians, Robert Ostrander. I know you're here, Bob. I saw you before, so I think he's here. He may be muted. Or American Academy of Pediatrics, Deborah Friedenberg.
Here.
American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, Maximilian Münke.
I'm here.
American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Stephen Ralston.
Hi, I'm here.
Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs, Sabra Ankner.
Here.
Association of Public Health Laboratories, Susan Tanksley.
I'm here.
Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. As mentioned yesterday, we do not have a representative yet, but hopefully we will have a new representative in the future. And Shakira Henderson from the Association of Women's Health, Obstetric and Neonatal Nurses is unable to join us today. There will not be a representative from the Child Neurology Society. From the Department of Defense, Jacob Hogue.
Here.
From Genetic Alliance, Natasha Bonham.
Here.
From the March of Dimes, Siobhan Dolan.
Here.
From the National Society of Genetic Counselors, Kate Walsh-Bockley.
I'm here.
And from the Society of Inherited Metabolic Disorders, Gerard Berry.
Here.
Thank you all.
Dr. Powell, this is Kamala. I'm not sure if you could hear me or not, but I'm here.
I knew you were on, so thank you, Kamala. I know you were having some problems connecting, but glad to know that you're here.
Thank you.
All right, so now I'm going to go over the meeting topics for today. The first item on the agenda for today is the phase 2 update on the evidence-based review for guanidino acetate methyltransferase or GAMP deficiency. Next, the committee will have a discussion on its capacity to review multiple nominations per year. Today, we'll have a second public comment period where we'll hear from Megan Pesch on the RUSP nomination of congenital cytomegalovirus, Heidi Wallace on the RUSP nomination of guanidino acetate methyltransferase deficiency, from Dylan Simon from the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, from Beth Vanoy from Minutes Matter MCAD, which is medium chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency, Mina Scavina from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. After a break, the committee will receive a presentation on newborn screening and health equity. We plan to adjourn the meeting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'll now turn it over to Mia Morrison, our designated federal official.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Members of the public, audio will come through your computer speakers, so please make sure to have your computer speakers turned on. If you can't access the audio through your computer, you may dial into the meeting using the telephone number in the email with your Zoom link. Committee members and organizational representatives, audio will come from your computer speakers as well, and you will be able to speak using your computer microphone. If you can't access the audio or microphone through your computer, you may dial into the meeting using the telephone number in the email with your user-specific Zoom link. Please speak clearly and remember to state your name first to ensure proper recording for the committee transcript and minutes. The chair will call on committee members and then organizational representatives. In order to better facilitate the discussion, committee members and org reps should use the raise hand feature when you would like to make a comment or ask a question. Simply click on the participant icon, choose raise hand. Please note that depending on your device or operating system, the raise hand feature may be in a different location. And if you need to troubleshoot, please consult the webinar instruction page in your briefing book. Next slide, please. To enable closed captioning, please select the closed captioning icon from your Zoom taskbar. From that menu, select show subtitles. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Powell.
Thank you, Mia. In April of 2021, the committee received a nomination for guanidino acetate methyltransferase deficiency for inclusion on the RUSP. This was the second time that GAMT had been nominated. At the August 2021 meeting, the nomination and prioritization work group presented an overview of the nomination package, and the committee voted to move GAMT deficiency forward to full evidence-based review. At the November 2021 meeting, the committee received the phase 1 update on the evidence-based review for GAMT deficiency. Today, Dr. Alex Kemper, lead for the evidence-based review group, and Dr. Lisa Prosser, ERG member, will provide the committee with the phase 2 update. I'll now turn things over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. The purpose of the presentation today is just to provide a high-level insight into where we are with the GAMT deficiency review and point out what I think are some key findings as well as our plans moving forward. I'm going to actually go ahead and do this whole presentation, including Dr. Prosser's part. You'll see why in a bit. Next slide, please. First of all, this is a list of our ERG members. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. DeLuca and Dr. McCandless for serving as the liaisons from the advisory committee to our work. Next slide, please. And this is a list of the technical expert panel members for this particular review. I've also marked those individuals who are also involved with the nomination of GAMT deficiency to be considered for the recommended uniform screening panel or the RUSP. I will say, as I have for the technical expert panel that we discussed yesterday, for MPS 2, the technical expert panel is really wonderful. It really provides great insight into the condition, sources of data, and really how we ought to consider emerging issues. So again, I want to thank all members of the technical expert panel. Next slide, please. So I'm going to begin as I did last time with a brief overview of GAMT deficiency. Next slide, please. So GAMT deficiency is a condition that causes cerebral creatine deficiency, and untreated that leads to global developmental delay with severe language delay, seizures, muscle weakness, movement disorders, and significant behavior disorders. Next slide, please. It's an autosomal recessive disease associated with the mutation in the GAMT gene. Located on chromosome 19. You can see some details about that there. But the hallmark of the condition is elevated guanidino acetate, or GUAC, as I'll call it for the remainder of the presentation, and low plasma and brain creatine. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the metabolic pathway. I'm going to revisit the metabolic pathway when I talk about treatments for GAMT deficiency. But again, I apologize because I don't have control over the arrow, but you can see where the GAMT enzyme is and how when it's there, it helps with the it helps with the production of creatine, and when it's absent, you have the buildup of guanidino acetate. Next slide, please. So the pathophysiology of GAMP deficiency is related directly to the low creatine levels, which lead to significant and progressive intellectual disability when it's not treated. Interestingly, as I've read the studies about GAMP deficiency, it seems that the guac accumulation itself also leads to problems with the disorder, including epilepsy and the extrapyramidal disorders, the movement disorders that are associated with it. In terms of evaluating the status of the condition, creatine and guac are the standard blood measures that are followed. But interestingly, you can follow involvement along with MR spectroscopy as well. And there are a number of studies that use that to look at the involvement with a lack of creatine in the brain. Next slide, please. In terms of the epidemiology, and again, we've discussed this before, the estimated prevalence is under 0.2 cases per 100,000 live births. But in the studies that have been done of existing samples to estimate carrier frequency, there's really a fairly wide range in carrier frequency. But again, it is a rare disorder. Next slide, please. In terms of clinical identification, and as everyone knows, our job is really focused on comparing clinical identification to what might happen with newborn screening. When you look at clinical identification, there's really a wide range of when individuals are diagnosed with a condition. In fact, I have one study up here that showed a mean age of about 12 years with a range of 2 to 29. And I think some of this is due to the fact of misdiagnosis or under a diagnosis that given the rarity, affected individuals might not ever get to the right diagnosis. As a matter of fact, I put up here a study that was a retrospective study that was done in France, evaluating over 6,000 subjects with unexplained neurological symptoms and found 7 cases. So I think that speaks to the challenge of clinical identification and probably does add some uncertainty around what we know about the epidemiology of the condition. Next slide, please. So let's talk about newborn screening. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an overview for the screening, what's involved with diagnosis of GAMP deficiency in infancy. Diagnosis is based on tandem mass spec screening for guac and creatine. And the diagnosis is based on finding low creatine and elevated guac in plasma sometime after birth, like a week after birth. There are other conditions that need to be ruled out. For example, arginase deficiency, another creatine disorder. And the molecular analysis is supportive. So again, just to highlight this again, screening is based on identifying guac and creatine in the dry blood spot, and diagnosis is essentially measuring those things sometime a little bit after birth. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight some of the newborn screening activities in the United States. There are newborn screening activities outside of the United States, but for the purposes of the talk today, I'm just focusing on the United States information. So screening for GAMP deficiency began in New York in October 2018 using a laboratory developed test. They began with a 2-tiered screening test looking at guac and creatine using flow injected tandem mass spec, and then as a second tier guac by HPLC. But as it turns out, they didn't need that. The second tier was discontinued in September 2021. As part of their evaluation, they do sequence the GAMP gene as part of the referral process. We talked about this before, that there are some newborn screening programs that include sequencing as part of their referral process, like New York. But again, that's not a critical thing for establishing the diagnosis. It's a biochemical diagnosis, but again, it can be helpful. Next slide, please. So in 2021, there were 211,242 newborns screened, with 7 borderline cases, ultimately leading to 6 referrals, 3 per 100,000. And you can see the outcomes of those cases here, but there was one case that was identified in New York. Next slide, please. In Utah, again, it's one of the things I want to remind the advisory committee as we talk about numbers of screens that were done and that kind of thing, is that Utah is a 2-screen state. Each infant has 2 newborn screening. Screening for GRAMP deficiency there began in June of 2015, again, using a laboratory developed test. From 2015 to 2019, they had a first-tier test based on guac and creatine using a derivatized assay, and then second-tier guac and creatine retest with liquid chromatography tandem mass spec. But now they use a non-derivatized method, and again, the guac and creatine is done as a send out as listed here. Next slide, please. So since the adoption of the current approach in 2019, there were about 78,000 screens, again, 2-screen state, but there was one infant who was went on to get a second-tier test, and that infant went on as a referral and ultimately was a case that was identified. So you can see the numbers per 100,000 screens here, not at the newborn level. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about treatment. Next slide. And I want to remind everyone of the metabolic pathway that's listed here, and the treatment, as you might surmise by looking at where the enzymatic block is with ornithine supplements and creatine supplements. So trying to minimize the buildup of guac, but assuring that there's ornithine for the urea cycle there, and then replacing the creatine that is not being generated. Next slide, please. So the key thing about treatment, so it's creatine, ornithine, and then sodium benzoate supplements. These things are available over the counter. So unlike some of the other conditions that we talked about, the treatment is more readily available and certainly less expensive. In addition to the things I talked about, there's dietary restriction of arginine. I should have mentioned that when we were looking at the diagram. Given the rarity of the disorder, the ideal timing of treatments is uncertain, but experts certainly recommend within a month of age. And then in addition to receiving the supplements, there needs to be serum monitoring over time. And as the child ages, that can be, the frequency can be reduced. But this, I hope, just gives you the flavor of what's involved with the treatment. Next slide, please. So what do we know about the effectiveness of early treatment? Because that's really a linchpin for the advisory committee. So you will not be surprised that given the rarity of the condition, it's hard to do clinical trials and to conduct either large prospective or retrospective cohort studies. So I'm going to focus on some case reports and case series that I think gives insight into what we know about early treatment. Next slide, please. So the first one I want to talk about is a case series of 48 subjects from 38 families that was collected through a survey of clinicians. You can see that for these subjects, the median age of diagnosis was 51 months with a remarkable range of prenatal to 34 years and treatment for all these subjects began soon after diagnosis. Increasing age of treatment start was associated with greater severity of intellectual disability. So that's not a surprise. The longer that individuals have gone on without treatment, the more likely that they're more likely to have intellectual disability. 3 subjects who were treated before 1 month in this large case series, with no developmental delay reported amongst those 3 subjects after a fairly variable period of treatment ranging from 14 months to 7 years. So again, this gives you some insight into the potential benefit of early treatment. Next slide, please. Another case report that we identified described a subject who began treatment at 28 months, who was followed to 6 years with persistent intellectual disability. So I put this case report up to try to figure out where is it that treatment really needs to begin to make a difference. And I want to contrast that with another case report of a subject who was diagnosed and treated at 8 days of life. This individual was diagnosed based on family history, and at least as far as 12 months, which is what's been reported, that individual had normal development. Next slide, please. We'll talk about some sibling cases. Here's a case report of an older sibling who was treated at 10 months after presenting with hypotonia, and at 6 years, still had delayed speech and fine motor skills. Again, I'm not able to go into greater detail about the developmental status of the individual. I just can go with what's been reported. But I want to contrast that with the younger sibling who is diagnosed prenatally and is normal at 42 months. Next slide, please. Here's another example. So an older sibling who is diagnosed at 2 years of age after presenting with significant developmental delay and seizures. And that individual's younger sibling began treatment at 22 days and is reported to be developmentally normal at 14 months. Next slide, please. And here's an abstract that we identified reporting cousins. So an older cousin began treatment around 3 years of age. And it was unclear in the abstract how long the subject had been treated, but this individual did have significant intellectual impairment, but did seem to have improved seizure frequency. In contrast, the younger cousin, who was evaluated 5 months, had normal development at 16 months. Again, there's limited information in abstracts. Next slide, please. So actually, can you go back one slide? Because I just want to finish this part up before I make a little bit of a transition. That given the rarity of GAMP deficiency, it's going to be these kinds of case studies and sibling studies that are going to provide the best evidence regarding the benefit of early intervention versus clinical case identification. In many ways, this is similar to the information that we described yesterday. Next slide, please. So our evidence review is from a screening standpoint. We're continuing to gather screening information, both within the United States and elsewhere, as I described before. And on the treatment side, really focusing on what we can find comparing early identification to later identification. Next slide, please. So, this brings up the issue of the projection and population level outcomes. Next slide, please. And as with yesterday, the goal of that is to compare projected outcomes from GAMP deficiency newborn screening for all newborns born in the United States. There are 3.6 million infants born each year with usual case detection in the absence of screening. Next slide, please. This modeling, again, is going to be very similar to what we showed yesterday in terms of screening outcomes, the number of cases of GAMP deficiency that might be identified, and compare that to the number that would be expected through clinical identification. Next slide, please. And this is the model showing a hypothetical cohort of newborns in the United States who either have newborn screening or go through the process of usual clinical identification. And we can report positive screens, negative screens, the false positives, the numbers confirmed with GAMP deficiency, and all these kind of short-term outcomes related to GAMP deficiency. But the level of evidence, I do not believe is going to be sufficient to be able to model longer-term outcomes of newborn screening, simply because of the rarity of the condition and the need to focus really on these case series and sibling studies. So in many ways, it's a similar story to yesterday. Next slide, please. In terms of the public health system impact survey, next slide, please. And as you know, that's to assess the readiness and feasibility of newborn screening programs to implement screening for GAMP deficiency. APHL, through the work of Jalila Jadu and Elizabeth Jones, coordinated a webinar that was held on January 14th. And the survey is to open next week, and APHL will be pushing all sorts of reminders and pushing people, haranguing people to make sure that those surveys are filled up, are completed. And of course, APHL will also be conducting in-person interviews with the programs that have adopted newborn screening for GAMP deficiency, as well as some others that might be representative of those who are not screening. So all that work is moving ahead as we normally would. Next slide, please. So I'd like to just stop there and see if there are any questions about either where we are with GAMP deficiency, or if there are recommendations for anything that you'd like us to look at in particular.
Thank you, Dr. Kemper. Yes, we'll now open it up for questions, first from committee members and then from organizational representatives, understanding that this is a sort of a high-level discussion at this point, as Dr. Kemper and the ERG will complete their work over the next 3 months, and the committee will see their final report prior to our next meeting, and we'll hear from our committee representatives on the ERG and their recommendation at that time. So as usual, remember to use the raise hand feature and state your first and last names for the record. Jennifer Kwan.
Hi, it's Jennifer Kwan. Alex, you had said that at New York, they were doing sequencing as part of their newborn screening process. I think that's what I heard. So I was just a little, I was interested in what to make of the 5 false positives.
I think I had to actually pull up the numbers again to take a look at it. What I can tell you again is that, screening, the sequencing is baked into the process. In terms of the details of, why exactly those false positives happen and those kinds of things, I can come back to you with that later.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful just for I know that this is still ongoing, but I think that would be helpful to know, because the New York State lab has I think clinicians are really comfortable with the amount of information they get from the New York State lab, because it really helps with clinical decision making. I was just curious about what maybe the variants were of uncertain significance, and some of those details I think will be helpful for the committee and the labs.
What's really interesting is, when we were talking to the technical expert panel, it's clear that it's a biochemical diagnosis. So figuring out exactly what the role is, but we can clarify that more for you. And as a matter of fact, I can send a follow-up email to the committee if you want to find out before 3 months from now.
Sean McCandless.
Thank you, Sean McCandless, committee member. Thanks for that update, Alex. Just a few questions for clarification, some of which you may be able to clarify now and some of which would be for the future. The first is that one of the slides said that in Utah, they use something called FIA mass spec. I assume that that's flow injection analysis. And just to confirm, that's pretty much the standard for tandem mass spectrometry, correct?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So this is nothing special.
No,
This
it's
would
nothing
require
special as opposed to like the HPLC and the LC stuff that I've been talking about before.
Yeah, good. So pretty much every state lab would already have this the equipment to do this. So
Right.
the assay might be different, might require some additional steps, but the
And what I can tell you is both the New York and the Utah screeners, as well as, we spoke to, experts in Canada that are involved with newborn screening for it as well, that, they'd like to highlight that this is, as close to something that's easy to add into existing tandem mass spec screening as you could hope. Now, I don't want to like cross the lines and see that I'm, pushing for it or not, but from their perspective, it's really just a marginal amount of additional work.
great, thank you. The second thing is that you made the statement that all of the treatments, sodium benzoate, creatine, and ornithine are available over the counter. Almost certainly, at least the creatine and ornithine will be considered nutritional supplements by insurance companies and not covered. So it'd be really helpful to have estimates of the expected cost of treatment for families, since there's unless there's some requirement that these treatments be covered, because if this is added to newborn screening, then this is almost certainly going to create it will create a requirement for the family to pay for the treatment themselves, and we would, I think it would be helpful to know what that burden will be.
So there's kind of two things related to that I want to look at. One is, the issue of cost and coverage, like you talked about. And the other thing is that if families opt to, just buy it over the counter, go to Amazon or wherever it is that you can get this stuff, are the standards such that they can feel reassured that they're getting the good stuff. And that's something that we'll have to rely on the technical expert panel to help us understand. But obviously, if they're getting it over the counter, we want them to make sure that they're getting the highest quality product.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. The final point that I would make is particularly pertinent, I think, after yesterday's evidence review and discussion, and that is that we have time right now to go back to the nominators and ask them. There are very few case reports that, as you alluded to, there's plenty of time for somebody to go back and track down every one of those reporters and compile a new list of updated information on long-term outcomes. And that would, and if any of you are listening, any of the people on the nominating committee, this would be very, very helpful in making a decision if we had that kind of updated data, and if it could be put together in time that it could be peer reviewed before we review it, that would be even better. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you made that recommendation.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up too about the cost of supplements, and thinking of biotinidase deficiency and biotin over the counter, and for some families it's nothing, it's minor added expense, but for other families it's can be quite a burden. So I think that will be important for us to hear more about. Scott Schoen.
So thanks. So I think, Alex, for the following up on what Dr. McCandless was saying around the flow injection mass spec, I think it would be good in the presentation in a few months to dive into a little bit more on that, how that's added to the existing amino acid carnitine and LDT and lysosomal storage disorder screening, that first tier, and a little bit on the what's going to, because there's no FDA cleared assay. So how does that going to be a burden. It's probably going to come up in the public health systems impact assessment survey. So I would ask Julie and APHL to really ask some of those questions, particularly obviously the New York lab, I think, runs an LDT, but Utah's running the FDA cleared kit. So it would be good to understand that a little bit more and just what that burden would be. Because while it is likely easy to add just to get the regulatory burden on the labs to do that. And I also wondered if you know now, or maybe in the future, why was the second tier assay discontinued in New York and then transitioned to a send out in Utah? My guess is that because of the low number of babies being reflexed, it was too burdensome to maintain. But is that accurate?
Yeah, no, so that's accurate. And then the New York, I actually have detailed information, but not at my hands. But basically, they felt that they could get away with just going directly without the second tier, and that to use the vernacular, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. That they were, finding what they wanted to find. But again, that's the kind of thing that when we come back in 3 months, we'll go through in deeper detail.
Any other questions or Sean McCandless, did you have?
Yeah, just Alex, I'm wondering if when we get a more detailed report, whether there'll be information from the other newborn screening programs you alluded to outside of the US?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
And now we can open it up to organizational representatives. Jerry Berry. Oh, you're muted.
So, hi, Alex, this is Jerry. I want to be careful in what I say about this, because I've not studied it properly, but there is some difference in the flux that exists in the utilization of arginine through the normal pathway that involves ureagenesis versus the pathway where there's entry into the mitochondria for biosynthesis. And this sometimes causes some problems in the newborn period with regard to being able to make diagnoses with some other disease processes. And I think it's something that we ought to study a little more. There may be a problem where some infants might not be detected, whereas others would, because of this shift in flux that exists in the newborn period.
I think I know what you mean, but it's well, I'm a general pediatrician too, so I always get nervous when I look at the Krebs cycle again. So what I will do is follow up with you afterwards, just to make sure that I understand the specific question, because I want to make sure that I get it answered appropriately.
Yes. I think we should look at this a little more carefully. There's another disorder where the flux is completely different in the newborn period, and so you're not able to make a diagnosis. And I wonder whether that might have an impact on false on the false negatives.
Yeah, I have no idea, but we will investigate.
Yeah, it could be trivial, but deserves some investigation.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions for Dr. Kemper? Yes, Shanika.
Dr. Kemper, will this newborn screening technology pick up other types of creatine deficiencies as a secondary finding because of the X-linked transporter, which would probably be more common, or are they just going to use guac as their primary and then secondary to the creatine?
Correct. So I don't think it's going to pick up the. I mean, again, I can confirm that with our technical expert panel as well. But really the focus is on GAMP deficiency and measuring guac, and then looking at the guac and creatine ratio.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Kemper, and to your team, and we look forward to discussion at our next meeting.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, going on now, we're going to talk about the committee's condition review capacity and initial discussion about this. As technology for newborn screening and treatment of rare heritable disorders advances, there's an increasing possibility that the number of condition nominations will outpace the committee's capacity to review nomination packages and conduct evidence-based reviews. The committee has heard from multiple stakeholders about this potential scenario. In August of 2021, the committee began exploring issues concerning this scenario in a presentation and discussion facilitated by Dr. Sean McCandless. During this discussion, the committee discussed the timeline and approach for conducting evidence-based reviews. Committee capacity and issues concerning the equity of the nomination process were also discussed. Next slide, please. The committee is budgeted to conduct 2 evidence-based reviews per year and must also balance committee member capacity and the rigor of reviewing nomination packages. Even with a larger committee budget and/or scaled-up approach to conducting evidence-based reviews, most states would not be able to keep pace with implementing multiple newborn screening conditions added to the recommended uniform screening panel in a short time frame. It currently takes most states between 3 to 10 years to implement a new RUSP condition. The expertise of the committee and the evidence review group is critical. The secretary recommends that every state screen for conditions on the RUSP because the ACHDNC has rigorous methods in place to assess complicated data and undertake an informed decision-making process. It might not be feasible to make condition reviews less intensive or to scale up and conduct the same level of review and analysis. The nomination and prioritization work group has well-defined criteria in place to review nomination packages. However, I've identified it as priority to define criteria for the prioritization of nominated conditions. On the next slide, I'll pose a few questions for your consideration, but before I do, please keep in mind that the committee and the NNP work group have a finite capacity to review nomination packages. Next slide. I feel that a key strategy will be to develop criteria to prioritize the review of nomination packages. To that end, and in building on today's discussion, within the next few weeks, I will convene a work group comprised of both current and former members of the advisory committee and other newborn screening and subject matter experts to discuss these issues. Today, it's important to gather your initial thoughts on this topic. For example, what are your thoughts on criteria for prioritization? What are the characteristics of a nomination package or condition that should be prioritized? What are your ideas for this process? From a different perspective, are there certain factors that would make a nomination package or condition not ideal for prioritization? What would the process look like? For example, would the entire committee vote to prioritize or not prioritize a condition? In the event that the committee receives multiple nominations at one time, should there be more than one NNP work group? I will now open up the floor for discussion. Committee members will discuss first and organizational representatives will follow. As a reminder, please use the raised hand feature in Zoom when you'd like to make comments or ask questions. When speaking, please remember to unmute yourself and state your first and last name each time you ask a question or provide comments to ensure proper recording. I'll say there was a paper that was published in December, a project done by Don Bailey, Holly PA, and others at RTI International that surveyed newborn screening stakeholders and got some of their thoughts about this issue and others just related to the advancement of treatment for rare diseases and how this committee and newborn screening programs in general will be able to handle this. So you might want to take a look at that if you haven't seen it already. Jennifer Kwan.
Hi, this is Jennifer Kwan, and I can't believe, I know it looks like I'm a megalomaniac because I'm always the first one talking, but I think this is an incredibly important issue. And I care a lot about newborn screening, and I think that our ability to sustain high quality newborn screening follow-up is really going to be impacted by the number of conditions and people who are advocates for those conditions, who are going to have new treatments that are being developed right now. I mean, I just feel like this is sort of coming down the pike. So as a new member, I have to say I'm not that familiar with the nomination and prioritization work group that you were discussing. I was wondering if you could share a little more about how they get formed and how, you know, how they're sort of brought online. Dr. Powell, if you would mind do that.
Sure. Sure. So the NNP work group is made up of 4 committee members plus the chair of the committee. And we try to get, you know, a fairly wide range of expertise in that area. You know, so for a clinician, newborn screening lab expert, someone with more primary care background, as well as knowledge and interest and expertise in ethical issues. And also we have a representative from the currently from the CDC. Carla Cuthbert serves on that
So
work
you
group.
choose them as soon as you see an application come in, basically?
No, it's a standing, pretty much been a standing work group, so that you know, unless people rotate off the committee, they, you know, continue to serve possibly indefinitely, but yeah, so
but they look
yeah.
at the application. They're the first people to look at the application.
Yes, so well, HRSA, so the application is submitted to HRSA, and HRSA reviews the application. And then if, you know, there are things that are missing, you know, they will go back to the nominators and ask for that additional information. And, you know, getting that back could take just, you know, a few weeks, it could take months. And then after the package is complete, as per HRSA, then it's given to the NNP work group for their review. And then usually it takes at least 3 meetings of the NNP work group to discuss the package, to go over all the questions that the NNP work group needs to answer prior to submitting their, you know, review to the full committee, and going over those questions and, you know, guidance, whether, you know, it's thought that the package is ready for or nomination is ready for a full evidence-based review or not.
Thank you.
Sure. Kyle Brothers.
Thank you. I think I'm contractually obligated to mention ethical issues when topics like this come up, so I'll just do that. So in other domains of health, you know, prioritization is based by an analogy on military triage, right? We focus our resources on the patients that can be helped the most. And unfortunately, this has come up during COVID with prioritization of ICU beds and ventilators and things like that. Unfortunately, I think in this case, that framework might not work so well, because we're deciding whether to do an evidence review, and it's really the evidence review that can help us assess what's our capability of helping, you know, children, you know, by proceeding with this process. So I think it might be difficult from the beginning to say, you this condition, because it is a more common condition, or because we think the intervention is more beneficial, that it should have a priority. So I think I could be convinced otherwise, but I think criteria like that might be difficult to implement in a state of sort of like initial, lack of information. We have some, projections about what the evidence says, but we don't really know until we get a full review. So maybe I think there are two possible solutions to that. One would be to say we can only consider and vote on conditions and prioritize that after a review. So it might be that we need to scale up our ability to do an evidence review while still accepting that we can only do one condition per meeting or something like that. And in which case, I think we would need to change the guidelines for the committee, because we have a specification about how much time passes between a nomination and a vote or further consideration. So, but another approach might be to simply take a first come, first serve framework and say, there's no meaningful way to prioritize conditions because there are many, value judgments involved in that. So we will say from the date that a nomination is fully, completed, it goes in the queue, and we will reach it as soon as we work through all the ones before that one in the queue. So anyway, just some ideas about how we might approach this.
Thank you. Yeah, there has been discussion about whether the NNP work group should do a more detailed review prior to sort of, making their recommendation. And, that's certainly an option. One of the difficulties in that is, they're committee members, they're already doing this as, volunteer work, dedicating their time to this, and to really carry out a thorough evidence-based review, is, I think, going to be difficult. We're currently short on a couple of committee members, that happened when, the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act was not passed, and we're still operating as a discretionary committee. We're hoping to add some new members, within the next year. But, it has been difficult to sort of, just have the time to review everything. So anyway, but thanks for your comments, Kyle. Scott Schoen.
Thank you. I have a couple different and disparate thoughts on this, and I'll try to articulate clearly. So I would just say, as a member of the NNP work group, I agree with everything Dr. Powell said. I mean, there are, and we've had it recently with this one after the other of MPS2 and GAMT and CCMV and more that I'm
Crabbe.
Crabbe, thank you, and Crabbe. And I just want to acknowledge the work of my colleagues on the NNP work group to really be diligent about that. And I think, Kyle, your point around not making value judgments is something that we have really taken to heart. We're not doing that, right? We're not trying to do an evidence-based review, but the reality is that the product that comes in drives the amount of effort and the pace at which they can be assessed and pushed through. And we've seen that with some conditions that have come through in my tenure on the NNP work group can get done in a couple meetings, and some have taken a few months of back and forth and reschedule and multiple meetings in a week or over weeks, because everybody's trying to do their best to get it through. So I think the education efforts of HRSA to help nominators hone in on what's critical in the nomination package is essential to make the work of the NNP group easier. That then just unfortunately shifts the bottleneck to the ERG, and really thinking about, do there need to be multiple ERGs? Alex Kemper is Superman, but I think that even his cape only extends so far. And so I feel that we need to evaluate not only the NNP process, but also the ERG. And as Dr. Powell articulated, there's only currently budgeting for 2 a year, which inherently restricts that the number that can go through But I do fear the tsunami that many people have talked about for a while. Don Bailey, when he was a member of this committee, talked about it, and he's still publishing about it. So I think that's very critical. I want to say that, you know, I picked up on Dr. Powell in your introduction. You said that that newborn screening programs are taking between 3 and 10 years to implement disorders after addition to the RUSP. And I'm sorry to be a broken record, but as Bob Ostrander said yesterday, this is what he and I do, is that even yesterday we talked about 1 to 3. And I think, so it's taking programs a while, depending upon the condition, to get these going. So we have multiple funnels. And I worry that we're going to get back to the situation we were in before this committee started, which is then individual states are going to get ahead of sort of national recommendations. And so I think we have to get this done, and we're already getting to that position. So my suggestion, I guess, would be that the criteria for the submission to the NMP work group and what we do at the NMP work group can be evaluated and make sure that we're still, you know, in agreement that that is what should hold. Maybe there is more that we could do at the NMP work group to help facilitate the ERG, but it still doesn't get to what if 3 came in on the same day, and how do we do that? And I don't have a good answer for that, and I'm hoping that the group that you pull together can dive into what are the options for that.
Thank you. Chanika?
I'm Chanika Panpakun, a committee member. I completely agree, and I think I appreciate Kyle saying that, you know, we can't really use the incidents or the treatment as the drivers. I think considering, you know, first come, first serve, it seems practical. But I also think that maybe that's an opportunity to, and I recognize the challenges of the resources to address and review and all that. So perhaps if we build in that if there are a backlog, is there an opportunity to expand the committee or increase the resources that go to this rather than this being a quote unquote volunteer, but it's a really more of a job from, you know, whatever federal government branch that really has to take this into account as part of caring for children. But I think it's probably a lot more complicated than what I'm trying to say. Thanks.
No, that's important. Thanks for that feedback. Jennifer Kwan?
Hi, it's Jennifer Kwan. Well, Scott, I was really hoping that you would share some changes for what should be prioritized. And I think that what I might say at this point, maybe in answer to what Kyle had brought up, is I think we all want to be fair. We all recognize that maybe taking it first come, first serve might inadvertently reward those who have better resources for a variety of reasons. And so I think we do want to have criteria. I think this is a great opportunity because Dr. Powell has pointed out we are a little bit in a crisis. I think that there are reasons why states are having a hard time putting conditions on their panels that we've recommended. I think that it's starting to feel a little less uniform across the country. And I think that if we can show that we're being thoughtful in these difficult times about what we look at and what we sort of push forward for more evidence, that may be helpful. I was struggling thinking, an obvious priority would be if this is a condition where the majority of those found to be affected clearly had early treatment. And by early treatment, I mean treatment that starts in infancy. That is a condition, that would seem like an obvious, condition to move forward, but we all know how even that type of criteria has so many problems. So I think establishing another work group to take a look at this is a great idea. Thanks.
Thank you. Sean McCandless. And I will get to the committee, to the organizational representatives. I just need to call on the committee members first. I'm sorry.
Thank you. This is Sean McCandless, committee member. I'll try to be brief because I think Jennifer said much of what I was going to say. I just want to push. I just want to say, though, I think that we have an obligation to not use a first come, first serve approach. I think we have to be able to prioritize. And I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. I think there are very clear criteria that have been proposed over many, many years for how to assess newborn screening. What is appropriate for newborn screening. And I think that having a work group that's going to work on trying to objectify as much as possible a measurement of impact of a screening program that's being nominated up front, so that the person nominating or the group nominating comes in with data as much as is known about prevalence, about the effectiveness of therapy, about the need for the benefit of initiating therapy prior to the onset of symptoms, the quality of long-term outcome data, and the feasibility of screening. We could create an objective measure that would allow for, it's not going to be completely objective, but it would be a fairly objective prioritization program that we could use to say this particular nomination up front appears to have significantly higher impact on the population-based compulsory newborn screening program than another nomination. So I'm strongly opposed to us settling for a first in, first out. I think that has many problems with equity and with appropriateness. And I think that we can look at impact because it's not a big secret of what an impactful newborn screening program should look like. The second is that I think we should upfront ask the nominator to make the argument for why newborn screening is the appropriate way for screening for this condition. Because I don't think that, as Janika said, and others have said, newborn screening is not the solution to the treatment of every condition in childhood. There are thousands of genetic disorders in childhood, and we will crush the system if we add all of them to the newborn screening program. So we have to be really thoughtful about what's realistic, and we need to incorporate that into the prioritization process. And I think one way to start doing that is to insist that the nominating committee have considered other options for screening, whether it's carrier screening, whether there's population-based screening postnatally that we always shy away from, but it's the standard of care in other aspects of our healthcare system, and it's done in discussion with the family. So I really don't understand why we are not able to discuss that around childhood diseases. And so I think there's many issues we could take into account, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness about this, Dr. Powell, in creating a task force or a work group to look at it and make recommendations to HRSA and HHS about how we might move forward in a more effective way. Thank you.
Thank you. Natasha Bonham.
Hello, Natasha Bonham, Genetic Alliance. Thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. I'm finding myself in a bit of a funny place because I don't think I typically disagree with Dr. McCandless, but I have to say that I too think we really have to look at the equity issues around this, and I don't know how you avoid that by not going in a queue. So I strongly want to make sure that that remains on the table to discuss, because I don't want there to be the assumption that every condition that we would be looking at has the same resources behind it. And so if you're going to base it off of an application that looks good and has all the data and is exactly what makes it easier to go through, maybe has support, or I shouldn't say maybe, it most likely has a level of support and funding that another group may not, another condition group may not have. I think this is particularly the case that, not all advocacy groups are structured the same way. Not all advocacy groups who oftentimes may be behind the scenes pulling together the materials, pulling together, providing often voluntary support to researchers and clinicians to get these applications together. They don't all have the same type of support. They may not have the industry ties that other groups do. And I think to start to prioritize, again, I think this is why we need a separate group to really parse out these issues. But it is not all created equal. And I would hate for a family to think just because their advocacy groups and their community is less resourced and I mean that both money, but also time and a lot of other things that go into this is because they are always, third in line and third in line again and again. So I think that really needs to be looked at. My other point is, I think no matter what happens in this, we have to be really clear in terms of what is the purpose of this committee and what is the expectation that is being set. Are we setting an expectation that this committee meets the pace of treatments that are available? I don't have a yes or no to that, but that is really telling, right? That then would inform, okay, do you actually need 5 NNP committees now? So just, I think that's going to be an important piece too. Just what is the expectation, both explicitly or implicitly, that you're setting around this? But I'm really happy that we're truly diving into this conversation now and appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Sabra Ankner.
Hi, Sabra Inkner from EMCHIP. Again, I want to echo Natasha, I'm glad that we're talking about this. I also want to say, and I think, Dr. Powell and Dr. Schoen touched on this a little bit, but if it's bad for y'all, how bad is it for the states and for the programs? They don't get funding for 2 conditions a year. They get funding for no conditions a year. And they don't get to leave behind the one, you guys are done with MPS 2 now. The jurisdictions at the programs are not. And so I just really, really want to emphasize that if this, if this has a small subset of the work to do is daunted by the amount of work there is to really reflect on what this pace does to the programs that are operating and their ability to do it well. I want to just, maybe this is almost too simple of a thought, but instead of having a rolling deadline, consider having specific, like say maybe there are 2 times a year that there is a deadline for applications beyond just the equity issues that I agree a first come, first serve approach creates. There's also the race that it can create and I want to get my package in now, even though I know there's a new paper coming out next week. But I'm not going to wait for it because I want to edge out whatever other potential nomination I think there is. That would also ease whatever kind of prioritization or choice making is needed to happen can happen all at once. Because I also think, like, how do you do prioritization when things are trickling in? Like, oh, well, now, we were doing this one, but now these guys jump over and we're going to leave this midstream. Just doesn't seem realistic. So I would just really encourage thinking about deadlines, like as a place to start. To Dr. McCandless's point about, is newborn screening the best way for things to be detected? The other thing I want to throw out there is, I feel like we're hearing somewhat newborn screening as solution to diagnostic odyssey, and can't be that solution, because as we have seen with MPS 2, it can create new diagnostic odysseys. So it's not just a case of whether prenatal screening or carrier screening or screening in childhood is the option, but also better education of providers and linkages and, again, systems of care, so that if primary care providers are seeing something they're not sure of, that they have places to go more quickly so that families aren't journeying for several years. And then the last thing that I want to say is, and these are things I couldn't say when I was managing a program. And I think that comes up a lot in things we talked about yesterday and in the reports that APHL and Jalili produce, is some of the lack of adoption that you're seeing is capacity. And some of it is a choice that they're not convinced. The programs aren't convinced that, which did not used to be the case. It used to be that if something was on the RUSP, everybody was, ready to go. And so I think that that's something for the committee to consider. If there's some disorders that are simply not getting picked up by the majority of places where there's not a legislative mandate to do so, and it is, I think they're showing with their feet. APHL survey does not ask, do you want to screen for this disorder? I've recommended it in the past. I haven't included that question. I don't know how many people would be able to say no because of the political implications there. But that's a factor that is not being discussed here that I think is really important. And so, yeah, I just really, whenever this committee is having a challenge, the labs and follow-up programs and subspecialists that are consultants, et cetera, are having them tenfold. And I really just want to center that.
Thank you. Stephen Ralston.
Thanks so much. I'm here for the American College of OBGYN. I am a maternal fetal medicine specialist, and I've been an ethicist for most of my career as well. And so I don't have very much substantive to add to this conversation. I just wanted to thank you for reminding me of some of these rare metabolic pathways that I haven't had to think about for 30 some odd years. And but I cannot emphasize how important it is for us to continue to think about these equity and justice issues as we are thinking about the very scarce resources that we have in our genetics professionals. And I think about with this from the perspective of OB, because we are running into the same issues now with prenatal screening and carrier screening and having all the counselors and geneticists that we need available to counsel about the many, many, many diseases we are screening for now. And as many of you know, ACMG just came out with their new recommendations for carrier screening, which is going to set an even larger burden on the very scarce resources that we have. Maybe that newborn screening is going to become moot because it's all going to be pre-newborn screening eventually, and that we're going to have whole exome sequencing from a heel stick of a pregnant woman, but that is in the future. But I have grave concerns about the capacity of the system to deal with all this. And when we are counseling our pregnant patients about newborn screening, because that's who does it initially, is the obstetrician, and we're telling them that it's very unusual that you're going to get a positive result, but the more diseases that we screen for, the more false positives we're going to get. And this is going to be burdensome on both the professionals that are dealing with it and on the patients themselves. Thanks.
Thank you. Scott Schoen.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, and thank you, Dr. Ralston, for your comments. And I love that ACOG is represented and part of the whole discussion on education. I really appreciate the comment you just made about the role of OBs in newborn screening. So going back to what Sabra Achner said, I do want to just say it's important to articulate that I don't think she meant it this way, but she said programs might be choosing not to. And I don't think it's programs. I want to be clear. Programs are not choosing to not. Let me back up. I don't want to do double negative. Programs are not making the choice of whether or not to add a condition. It is the system in which they are placed in their individual state that has conditions conducive to more rapid implementation or slower implementation. Dr. Tanksley has my favorite figure of all time, the jelly bean diagram of the system of newborn screening. And what I think needs to be added to that is procurement and HR and facility management and construction, and all of those precede the 1 to 3 years that I keep joking about, right? I mean, I don't mean to joke about it, but 1 to 3 years assumes you're all ready, and that's true. Like, I actually agree. Once the construction's done and the procurement, the contracts in place, the people are hired, it actually probably takes 2 years for most programs, if not less. But there are years in advance, so programs are working on all of this. I don't think anybody should take away the message that programs are making a choice not to do this. every newborn screener in this country is dedicated to the health, safety, and well-being of newborns when they come into their state. And so that is a constant effort. And I think that what I'm worried about is there's a growing number of requirement legislation spreading. We have one now in North Carolina that you have to implement within 3 years of RUSP. Okay, again, that makes our RUSP more of a required universal screening pattern than a recommended. And I think that's a burden we now need to understand and bear. And when we do this, we need to understand that there is that system of not only the newborn screening program, but the physicians and clinicians and everybody else that's involved in the insurance and the Medicaid that has to catch up. So requiring a newborn screening program to add something is short-sighted when it's the newborn screening system and the healthcare system that has to take on the burden. And I thought about this as others are talking, and I would like to call on my other federal partners to talk about this. This is it's a HRSA subcommittee, but we're advisory to the Secretary of HHS, under which HRSA and NIH and CDC and other agencies fall. And I'd really like to suggest, Dr. Powell, that in the task force you bring together, that we identify ways for those agencies to have cross-functionality. And maybe it's already going on and I'm ignorant to it. And what I would love to hear is at the next meeting, what's going on, but to link the pilot studies that Dr. Parisi's team is looking for and identifying and moving forward with, and the method development and the quality control method development that Dr. Cuthbert's team is so desperately working on, and the long-term follow-up and the education campaign that HRSA's, and how are they linked? Because if we can link them all together, we might have better success on all of the things we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah Friedenberg.
Hi, I'm Debbie Friedenberg, AAPR rep. So there are a couple of things that I just wanted to comment on. One is a little specific. When we think about moving screening out of newborn screening, the equity issue becomes more prominent in that we know the whole population will not be screened in those at that time point. And also point out that even carrier screening, we've been carrier screening for CF forever, but the vast majority of babies that we diagnose with CF have not had, parents have not had carrier screening. So even there's the uptake is not universal. And the only way we reach the whole population at this point in time is with newborn screening. And so I think that needs to be something thought about from the equity standpoint as well. And then the second point, and a lot of people have addressed this, is the impact on the programs that are actually doing the screening and the follow-up for the clinicians, in that as we go through higher throughput, the burden increases exponentially on the programs. You know, if we multiplex things, fine, you know, it may not be that burdensome, but as we add more, if we have more reviews and we expand that, which means probably it will come through the whole committee, and at some point they probably will be added on. And it's just that, you know, if you tell a program we're adding 10 new conditions, I think that most programs would have a meltdown at that point, both for resources and space and personnel. And all of the programs now are having trouble with personnel. You know, they're state-based programs, salaries are not equitable to industry and other settings. And so there are personnel shortages, there's space shortages, there are all sorts of challenges that programs are working through. And so if you start adding many at the same time, I'm not certain how a program would be able to accomplish that.
Thank you. Sabra Enkner.
Hi, Sabra Enkner, AMCHIP. I just wanted to respond to Dr. Schoen and just clarify. I did mean what I said. That choices are being made. Some of them are, you know, I'm hesitant to call out any individual places, but you know, there is one state that funded through APHL and New Steps did a deliberative community engagement process where they brought together community members to look at XALD, Pompeii, and MPS 1 and determine if that was the right, you know, thing for that state to do. And it was determined no, and they're not screening for those three things. You know, there, as a person who ran a program where I only had, we used a different lab, but I only had the option of what our lab screened for, but nevertheless, it was still a conversation of, we are onboarding this, do you want to? That is in fact part of the conversation. And you're looking at, and perhaps it's more of a conversation in places with very small populations with perhaps unique ethnic makeup, where you might be screening for things nobody else is screening for, as we did in Alaska, because we knew what occurred in our population, and that there is not a known occurrence of another disorder. So I just want to clarify that absolutely some of those decisions through advisory committees, through expert panels, through conversations with commissioners, leaders, whomever, but those things are happening.
Natasha Bonham.
Thank you, Natasha Bonham. In listening to this, and I think this often happens in our conversations about newborn screening, we'll be having a conversation at what I would consider a more micro level, but the issue is actually more macro. And we keep talking about equity. And I feel like sometimes in the same breath, we're saying newborn screening is, we get every baby, it's equitable, but then the next thing we're saying is showing all the different ways that it isn't. And as long as newborn screening is completely state-based and those decisions are made at that state level at different times, I don't know how fully we can say newborn screening is equitable. And so again, I think this is again highlighting a system-wide issue in terms of how do we define equitability. And I know we're going to have a session later on today, which is great to really start delving into this, but we can't solve that bigger issue of it is different in different states and there are different processes, and at the same time say we need to keep it equitable. I don't know. I don't think I'm being as direct and eloquent as I'd like to be, but I just want to highlight, we're talking about a lot of different things in this conversation. It's not just about how do we set a list of conditions that are coming in.
Right. Susan Tanksley.
Hi, Susan Tanksley, Association of Public Health Laboratories. I'm going to start by responding to Natasha and about equity, and I think it's all relative, right? So there's the issue of equity, and newborn screening creates a more equitable situation, but it's still not perfect. So more babies get screened for something if it gets put on the newborn screening panel, but then as we talked about yesterday, it creates additional issues in equity. And so, it's every step of the process where we run into issues of equity. And I'm glad we're talking about it and we're raising the awareness of the issue. But I think as we evaluate it, we're going to continue to run into it. And I think it's a scale, and we're going to have to, it's like, we don't want to create a situation where it makes it worse. It's, it's do no harm, but everything we try to do has implications. In response to the conversation about states and choices, Scott mentioned it's a system, and it's true within a state. Newborn screening is state-based. It's not a federal mandate. However, it does feel like a mandate when a condition is placed on the RUS, but it is some states do have a process for adding conditions to their panel, and every state has a process for adding conditions to their panel. And some of them include additional evidence review. They take information, they gather information, and they make a decision. Is it right for their population? But that is not a newborn screening program person sitting down and making that decision on their own. That may be the advisory committee. That may be an entire process that's developed in a state. Dr. Schoen is absolutely right in saying that, as newborn screeners, we try our hardest to do the best job we can on a daily basis. And the pandemic has made our jobs exponentially harder. And it really, you know, the things that we face on a daily basis, just with staffing shortages, to be able to, and reagent shortages and consumable shortages, to be able to do our testing on a daily basis, what we're doing now without adding something new is really hard. And so just continue, you know, I'm sure everyone out there is facing challenges of their own from that, but please keep those things in mind too, as we talk about that 1 to 3 years. Thank you.
Thanks. Carla Cuthbert.
Wow, Scott Schoen. I would like to comment on a couple of things. I'm a federal partner. I am also on the nomination and prioritization work group with Sean and Scott. And, you know, I want to say that I wholeheartedly support their comments. I think one of our biggest challenges as we review these packages has been, we know what we need to look for, we just can't seem to find it. And we struggle and, you know, and much of it is that there is a lack of clarity within the packages that we actually get. So again, anything that allows for more complete data within the packages would be very helpful. I have to say, I like the idea of having a deadline for packages so that it doesn't sort of come out of, you know, oh my goodness, we've got another one right now. I think that that would be nice. I do hear what Natasha said about equity and those issues, and the issues that if you have a lot of funding going into putting your package, you're going to have a great package. And I completely get that. And I don't know if there are ways that we can perhaps have better education as to the kind of data that we need that will really be able to allow us as reviewers to be able to say, yeah, they've got all of the check marks ticked, they've done it well, we can see it very clearly, the evidence and the data is there, and just move it forward. So, you know, there's a lot that's happening here that I really agree with. We are all stressed, and with what Sabra said, with the limitations within the states, that, you know, if we're having a stressful time making it through our process, the states are even having a greater challenge. And we know this because we fund the states as well. And we know that it is challenging. I have to say that with Scott's comment about there is a lot that has to be done from the moment you actually start that clock ticking. And I appreciate that too, because you know, when we put money out the door, we want to be able to have states pick it up. And often as funding entities, we're in crisis when we go, but there's not enough people applying for our money. What do we do? It's because the states have to be ready before they can say yes to the federal partners. We can take your money and we know that we can get this turned around in 2 years. So Scott, thank you for that. I really appreciate what you said there. And Scott, you are awesome. And I think all of the federal partners flinched a little, which not in a negative way. I just want you to know, because we've had this conversation before. Are the federal partners working together? Are we talking, you know, you have all of this money, are you working together and coordinating? And again, I want to be very mindful that when we say federal partners, we're not talking about one entity with one mission. Okay, we are from different agencies. We have very different missions attached to us. HRSA dollars is not necessarily the same as CDC dollars, is not necessarily the same as NIH dollars, and they really serve to function in different ways. I heard the appeal yesterday when they said we need money. I know, we know that. If you know how government works, we can't say we want more money. That's really illegal for us to be able to go out and try to petition. That is definitely not okay. And we absolutely do understand the need. So again, I know that Michael Warren is on the call, and our other partners are on the call as well. Are we working together? Yes, we do have conversations. We have monthly calls where we discuss where we are and what we're doing. There are certain federal partners that I have on speed dial that I run ideas by. If we're thinking of certain things that we discuss, as much as we can collaborate, we would like to. It's not always easy to move dollars between agencies or to even fund in similar ways because the money is directed to different activities. But I do want you to know that we hear that call. And again, I see Michael nodding. Are we doing, can we do more? Yes, I think that we can do more. I think that we can always do more and try to figure out ways that we can coordinate a little better. So I do hear what you're saying, but I also do want you to know that we're not acting in isolation as federal partners. When we do have ideas, we do share it with each other. And again, working in different lanes, trying to provide support to the state. So I do want to let you know that we do hear you, and we're with you in this regard. And I just wanted to offer that comment, and thank you, Sean, for Scott. Was I saying Sean all the time? Scott, for what you were saying. So I'll stop right now.
Thank you. Michael Warren.
Thank you, Michael Warren, HRSA, and thank you, Dr. Cuthbert, for your comments. I think as the committee or this subgroup that you're putting together is thinking through this, helping also to map out where the sort of fixed parameters are. So, for example, we're in a space, and I want to be careful as a Fed not to cross. I will try to stick to facts. I don't want to get into an advocacy realm. But the law is what we operate by. And so right now, the current law has lapsed, but the previous law actually put in parameters around the timing by which a review had to be completed. So once the nomination committee moved forward and the committee decided to move something to evidence review, the clock started ticking according to the legislation. So that's one of those parameters I think as the group is thinking to think through where are those guardrails. The other gets back to the issue that you raised earlier around what are the limitations from a budget standpoint. So if we think about, for example, how this is funded, what line that comes from, what other things are funded out of that line, and what's available for evidence reviews, those both influence this process. And so as the team is working through that, if there are questions that we can provide answers to, happy to do that. But I think those parameters are real and important ones to consider. They're not within our purview to change. There are people who can change that, not at HRSA or CDC or any of the federal agencies.
Max Mienke.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. I'm Max Münke. I'm the CEO of the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics. ACMG as part of our mission is really newborn screening. And we are fortunate, and I'm grateful to the federal agencies here. I want to thank them that we have funding. We have funding for NCC that comes from HRSA, and we do the ACT sheets. And the goal is to have ACT sheets for eventually for every newborn disorder, for every condition that's on the RUSP, and expand those. We have long-term follow-up grant from HRSA. Then, of course, we have the Newborn Screening Translation Research grant from NICHD. And on top, we have funding from ClinGen, from NHGRI for ClinGen. So all of those help newborn screening. And I think the part, so clearly ACMG wants to be involved in this effort here. The part that I wanted to comment on and really appreciate Natasha Bonhomme's comment about equity. I think equity is very hard. It's very expensive. And I can tell you it's getting more expensive. And it's getting more expensive, if you indulge me, just to look at the scenario. What if some conditions will not be studied biochemically in a newborn screening, but what if some will be screened by whole genome sequencing? And what I learned in the process in discussing it with companies who do this, they tell me the analysis of a genome of a person of Northern European descent is very easy because we have had practice with it for years and years, if not decades. And it's difficult if you want to do the same thing in individuals from diverse backgrounds. So I think we will have to be prepared if we feel equity is important, and I want to be sure to let everyone know for ACMG, equity is one of the most important issues that we have in healthcare. And I'm very committed to equity of what ACMG can do. And I'm at the same time fully aware there are ethical issues there are funding issues there, and there are issues of possibly not having the workforce to do all of what I think we need to do to eventually have some equity that goes for all, 3.6 million newborns in the US here. So I think with that, I'm very passionate about the equity part and hope to be part of any efforts that have to do with the future of these efforts here. So thank you.
Thank you. Natasha Bonham.
Hi, Natasha Bonham. And I appreciate the fact that this conversation has probably gone in a good direction that maybe some weren't anticipating, but since we are there, I do just have to kind of call out the fact that, you know, equity isn't relative if it's impacting you and you're not getting what you need or what you feel is promised to you. So let's, you know, I just want us to be thoughtful about those words. And I understand it's hard. You know, I think we have these conversations again that, you know, we may be thinking about, oh, what are our next steps on this? And then it turns into this big conversation. And we always get to the point of it's so hard for states and it's so hard to run these programs. And that is true. Trust me, I know when state-based legislation is going through, I get the phone calls from people saying, how can advocates think that we're going to be able to do this? So I really appreciate that. However, it's hard throughout the system. And I really just want us to be thinking about when we're talking about these themes, that it's not just about the testing and it's not just about what's happening in the labs, but for us to really embrace it's the entire system, and families are part of that system too. And the slide that we keep referencing, families are at the center of that. So just really reiterating that and making sure when we are thinking about these systems and when we're thinking about different processes, and if we do have this subcommittee, work group, looking at nomination and prioritization, that we keep that in mind. It's not just a slide. It's what we say is the core and the heart of newborn screening. Thanks.
Sabra Ankner.
Sabra Ankner, AmChip, and apologies for speaking again. I just wanted to follow up to what Dr. Minke said, which, you know, to just say out loud, it's not like it's inherently easier to sequence the genome of a person from Northern Europe. These are choices that we have made. The expense that will be incurred because we have allowed and chosen to have racism build our system, that's going to cost us money because there were choices made and are still being made to focus on certain populations. We see that again in our own work, that we don't know whose pseudodeficiencies occur, and we don't, you know, we're often surprised at the way that a disease presents in different populations when we implement population-wide screening. And so the reasons that these things are hard now is because the system is working exactly as it was intended to work historically, and to clean that up and to work on improving it is going to cost money. It's going to be hard. It's going to take time, but it also is going to require conversations like this. And so I'm glad we're having it.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, I think if you could put the slides back up. We really appreciate all the comments and feedback. This will be very important as we move forward. Is there one more slide? Okay, so as I mentioned, we will be forming a work group comprised of current and former committee members and other subject matter experts to develop criteria and a process for prioritizing the review of nominated conditions. The committee will be kept apprised we'll obtain their feedback throughout the process. I'm, encouraged that we have a new nomination form and the materials that are now available on the HRSA website, the frequently asked questions and other guidelines. I think the more complete the package that's submitted can be, the easier the NNP work group work will be, as well as, should it go to the evidence review. There's certain things, we talked yesterday about follow-up and the need to have, specific thoughts from the nominators about, what that follow-up will look like, both the short and long term. I think that's, really critical for the nomination package, is to get some information about that, because, that is going to play a very important role if and when a new condition is, put on the RUSP and implemented in states. But there's certainly a lot of things that we'll need to talk about. I'm getting a lot of sort of questions from potential nominators about, the difficulty in getting a newborn screening pilot for their, condition done, and how are we going to do that? I mean, we may be faced with conditions that have, really promising treatments that are available, but, many advocacy groups, researchers, clinicians, clinician scientists, they don't have the means to get a population-based newborn screening pilot done. And so how are we going to do that? So I hope that that's something else that this work group can think about, because it does play a role in our ability to evaluate the nominated conditions. So anyway, I thank you all once again for your input. Feel free to contact me with more thoughts, and also Mia is available. So we are a little bit ahead of time, but my understanding is those who will be giving public comments next are available. Yesterday, we received public comments specifically on newborn screening. Yes.
So sorry to interrupt. I just want to verify that we do have all of our public commenters available.
Sure.
LRG, were you able to locate Megan Pesh?
I haven't found Megan Pesh, but you should be able to raise your hand so we can confirm if you're on, Megan.
Is her hand appearing?
Not seeing it, so maybe we'll go ahead with, let's see, Heidi Wallace was going to be the next speaker, so.
Great. Good morning. Hi, my name is Heidi Wallace. I'm the executive director for the Association for Creatine Deficiencies, and I'm very grateful for just a couple minutes of your time. Thank you, Dr. Kemper, for the really excellent presentation this morning. I want to just address a couple of the things that came up, and also thank you for having public comments after the presentation. It's really helpful to be able to respond on some of this right away. First, the creatine and ornithine costs for the children with GAMP deficiency and how we treat them. We did a study, the Association for Creatine Deficiencies, of the costs that most families are paying, and we looked at the CDC growth chart and the weight of children, and then the recommended dosage of each supplement. And we have a treatment document that I can share with committee members. But just to give you an idea, at 2 years of age, the cost is $31.50 per month. So that does increase as the child grows. But in my parental opinion, I feel it's fairly reasonable. I should add, I am the parent of 2 children with GAMP deficiency. My daughter was diagnosed when she was 5, and she is now 18. She is intellectually disabled and has recurring seizures. And the costs of our emergency care and our specialist care for the many doctors she sees is way beyond our costs of supplements. So, in the grand scheme of things, this cost is not even an issue, I feel. And then as far as families getting coverage, about half of our community is able to get coverage. Some of us get this through our states that cover medical formulas, medical foods, and we work with our insurance company. It does take a lot of back and forth, but about half of our community has been able to get some coverage and support. Another thing that came up was a comment that Utah is using an FDA kit and then running GAMP separately, and that's not correct. Utah does not use an FDA kit. They are screening GAMP with the FIA with all of their other amino acids and acylcarnitines. It is a lab developed test, not a kit. And on that topic as well, ACD worked with the state of Utah and looked back at their cost of implementation, the estimated hours for staff for validating the test, and the reagents, and factored in everything. And beyond implementation, the ongoing costs, and I know that this raises political, pain with some people. It is a lab developed test. It is one state's experience. So I'm not advertising this as, what it will be for every state, but I think it's just a good a reference to have. The ongoing cost is estimated at 19 cents per screen. And that is a very padded estimate. It includes at the labor costs of staff reviewing the additional analyte every week, any follow-up needs on a very padded number of repeats beyond what is actually seen. And I'm happy to share that document as well. Another topic that came up is Utah's second tier and why is it being sent out? Utah initially screened for GAMP when ARUP was doing the amino acids acylcarnitines, and when tandem mass spec was brought in-house, the second tier was left at ARUP. So it's that is why it's out of house. Another question was about other kinds of creatine deficiencies and could they be detected? The two other kinds are the X-linked creatine transporter deficiency. There is not conclusive research yet to identify a method for screening. So I would say, no, we can't say that could be a disorder detected by a GAMP screening. The other disorder is somewhat similar to GAMP, it's AGAT, and they've actually, an AGAT patient has the reverse results with their guanidino acetate. They would be extremely low. And right now, the lower limit of detection of instruments tends to not be really, really great. And so it's not thought that AGAT can be picked up at this time with the screening. So it would just be a GAMP screening. There were some questions about false positives. And I just throw out that these are typically NICU babies. And there's more information in the paper published, prospective identification by neonatal screening of patients with guanidino acetate methyltransferase. This was a collaboration between ARUP, the state of Utah, and the state of New York, and shares all of their data very beautifully. So I think a read over of that will answer many of the questions that came up very well. And then there was discussion about the outcomes for children diagnosed earlier and later, and that there needs to be some more documentation, some more peer-reviewed papers on that. And there is a sibling study being conducted right now with several different sibling pairs where one sibling was diagnosed very early because of the older sibling, and that should be completed by the next meeting in May. So that is coming forward. And then I just want to throw in a little bit of the reality of the disorder. Like I said, my children both have GAMP, and my daughter, I recently had to do intake work for her to receive services from the state, and they asked me, very basic questions. Can she safely ride a bus? Could she work a job? Could she defend herself? defend her finances, defend herself physically. And I had to answer no to every single one of those questions. She's very, very much disabled, being diagnosed at 5.5 after, many years of, oh, it's developmental delay. Hang on, just keep waiting, do these therapies. Oh, you're on the autism spectrum by 1 point. So I don't know any families who have received this diagnosis in time to have a very good outcome for their child, unless it's because of a sibling history. My son is 10 and he is absolutely a typical 10-year-old boy. He's very social. He's doing well in reading. He's above his grade level for reading. He does well in math. We have no problems with him. So this is a very, very important blessing for a family to receive a diagnosis from newborn screening, and it truly will change lives. And I will dip my toe in the conversation that just went on and say, also my background is I worked for several years with the Utah Newborn Screening Lab. So I do have some experience and some knowledge and understanding of the difficulty and challenges of implementing a new disorder. But I will say from my perspective, I look to this committee as an advisory committee. I think there is an obligation that if there is a disorder that you can honestly say, we advise this should be screened from birth. It meets our criteria. Although it can be very difficult for some states, I think that there's an obligation to make that advice, to move that disorder forward, because this is an advisory committee creating a recommended screening panel, and it's up to each state if they follow it or not. I think the idea of asking the states if they like a disorder, if they want to screen for it, as a parent, I find that very upsetting. I think it should be, we have criteria, you meet it or you don't. And if you do, we advise for it. And if a state doesn't want to, that shouldn't affect an advisory committee or a recommendation. So those are just my 2 cents from the outside view of this. And thank you very much for all you're doing. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm told that Megan Pesh is now available.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Chairperson Powell and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak and share my perspective today. I'm an assistant professor of developmental and behavioral pediatrics at the University of Michigan, and I'm also the president-elect of the National CMV Foundation. As some of you may know, along with our nominating committee, the foundation submitted a nomination package for your consideration of the inclusion of congenital CMV on the RUSP, and that package was was submitted most recently in the fall of 2021. As many of you may know, congenital cytomegalovirus, or CMV, is a viral infection that's vertically transmitted from mother to fetus, and it can be associated with adverse outcomes, including sensorineural hearing loss, cerebral palsy, and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. Congenital CMV affects 1 in every 200 US infants, which will forever blow my mind. The spectrum of outcomes is broad, and thankfully, most children will have typical outcomes, but 1 in 5 will develop long-term sequelae, including hearing loss. And the hearing loss can develop, can be present at birth, can be delayed in onset, and is common even among those infants that are born with what is deemed as asymptomatic infections at birth. To be completely frank, congenital CMV was not on my radar at all outside of answering board questions until late 2018 when my 3rd daughter was born. Her name is Odessa, and she looked perfectly healthy at birth, save for a few petechiae on her face. She failed her newborn hearing screening, but at that time she startled when her big sisters were loud, so I wasn't worried. And frankly, as a pediatrician, I had spent my career reassuring anxious moms that this hearing screen was likely a false positive. But you can see where this is going. At 2.5 months, we found out that she had, by that time, profound bilateral hearing loss. And at 4 months, we found out that the etiology was congenital CMV. At that time, Odessa's head ultrasound showed cysts and calcifications from the virus. And because of her late diagnosis, she missed that ideal window for treatment with antiviral medication, which has been found in an RCT to be associated with improved hearing and developmental outcomes in the long term. But that medication needs to be started before 31 days, according to the research we have right now. And I don't want to just share my sob story. Odessa, I have a picture of her because, you know, what mom can't help? Can you even? So she is a rambunctious preschooler now, but she has autism, she has seizures, she has bilateral cochlear implants, apraxia. She is a delight, but her life is forever changed by this disease. And you know, here's the thing, is like, I don't actually think her doctors missed anything at birth. And I mean that to say that I was staring at an infant with severe congenital CMV for months without it ever crossing my mind. Congenital CMV can't be diagnosed based on clinical presentation in the vast majority of infants. And for the most severely affected infants, antiviral medication is a treatment option in early infancy. And for all infants, regardless of severity, monitoring of their hearing is treatment. And they could have the opportunity to get intervention for that hearing loss should a loss develop. Recent studies have shown that parents want to know if their child has congenital CMV, even if they never end up developing sequelae. This is why I am strongly in favor of universal newborn congenital CMV screening. As with many diseases discussed in this panel, the evidence basis for CMV screening is growing. There are still gaps in the literature that need to be filled, but there is a lot of exciting work underway currently. I look forward to your feedback on our nomination, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Dylan Simon.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, and to the members of the committee. On behalf of the EverLife Foundation for Rare Diseases, I'd like to thank the committee for providing me the opportunity to address you today to update you on the recent newborn screening initiatives here at the foundation. Again, my name is Dylan Simon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Director of Public Policy for the EverLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. The EverLife Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering the rare disease patient community, advocate for impactful science-driven legislation and policy that advances the equitable development of and access to life-saving diagnoses, treatments, and cures. At the federal level, we've been leading rare disease community coalition efforts dedicated to the passage of the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Reauthorization Act. The legislation passed out of the House last June, but is still being held up in the Senate due to a proposed informed consent amendment. This is the same informed consent amendment that has been holding up the reauthorization for the last 2.5 years. We are convening nearly 1,000 rare disease community members later this month through our annual Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill. Advocates will meet with their elected representatives to reflect on the importance of newborn screening and seek the support of the legislation. Following on this critical momentum established by our advocates, we will continue to work with the rare disease community to ensure that the impact of the passage of this legislation will have on the patient communities as well understood by policymakers. We are also remain focused on shortening the timeline between when a condition has been added to the RUSP and when it's screened for at the state level. Once conditions have met the evidentiary requirements of the RUSP edition, the same patient organizations who led that RUSP nomination process then face the additional hurdle of state implementation. That process that can require significant resources and many more years. The EverLife Foundation RUSP alignment legislation ensures that states must screen for all RUSP conditions within a specified amount of time following conditions adjacent to the RUSP. And importantly, it also ensures that there's a long-term funding source for the newborn screening programs to help facilitate the implementation. Within the states where this legislation has passed, we've worked with state laboratories, legislators, and departments of health to ensure that both the resource and timeline requirements meet the needs of each state program. We have successfully passed this legislation in California, Florida, Arizona, Georgia, Ohio, and North Carolina, and are currently pursuing similar legislation in Maryland, Mississippi, and Iowa. I'm also happy to update that in all three of those states, the legislation has been introduced in both chambers and is moving through, which we're really excited about. Finally, we're excited to highlight that on December 29th, JAMA Network Open published the article Expert Evaluation Strategies to Modernize Newborn Screening System in the United States. This is the paper that Dr. Powell was referencing earlier that came out of Don Bailey and the RTI team. This is a first of its kind study that evaluates opportunities and challenges facing the U.S. newborn screening system and presents a suite of proposals to modernization of the cross-section of experts. The study, which was conducted again by Don Bailey at the RTI International team, with support from the EverLife Foundation, by Marine Pharmaceuticals, Orchard Therapeutics, Sarepta Therapeutics, and Travere Therapeutics, concluded that building a next-generation newborn screening system will require extensive stakeholder engagement to create community consensus, a willingness of federal agencies to cooperate in implementing solutions, and intensive effort to harmonize state policies and resources, and ultimately national legislation. I would like to especially thank that many of the community experts who participated in this study and formed this effort. As we move ahead, we are excited for the next steps in this process as we work to determine how we can utilize the study, work as a community to bring about critical updates and enhancements to our newborn screening system. In 2022, we're looking forward to working with you and all leaders within the newborn screening ecosystem to utilize the momentum from this paper to discuss how best to modernize newborn screening. We're excited for all the great work that's occurring within the newborn screening space and looking forward to continue to help advocates effectively navigate and engage within the community. Thank you again for your time and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Beth Vinoy.
Hi there, good afternoon. My name is Beth Vinoy. I'm the parent of a child with the metabolic disorder MCAD and the founder of the nonprofit Minutes Matter MCAD. I come before you today because I know that my passion is your passion. We all share the common goal of being dedicated to ensuring that all babies receive timely newborn screening so that they have the best chance to live a healthy, happy, and productive life. But the reality is we still have work to do so that newborn screening results are more timely returned to families for time-sensitive disorders like MCAD. This is evidenced by patient stories from 3 families that I would like to share with you today. Emery Greiser was the daughter of Patricia and Trey Greiser. Emery was the Greisers' first and only child. She was born at 1:35 a.m. on July the 15th of 2021 in the state of Maryland. At about 8 p.m. the next evening, July the 16th, Patricia was holding Emery. They were still in the hospital, and Emery stopped breathing. Doctors and nurses worked on Emery for hours trying to revive her, but it was too late. Emery had suffered a metabolic crisis. Her newborn screening results were returned 3 days after birth, 1 day too late. Emery was positive for MCAD. Abel Davis was the son of Heather and Braden Davis. Abel was born on May 8th of 2020. What a sweet and joyous Mother's Day they shared at home as a family on Sunday, May the 10th, after being discharged from the hospital. But by Monday, May 11th, Heather noticed as she was nursing Abel that he was not latching on well and that his breathing seemed off. And within 20 minutes, Abel was hypoglycemic. He was rushed to the hospital, they now know, in a metabolic crisis. The crisis was too much for his little body. He passed at 3 days old. The next day, day 4, his newborn screening results were returned. Abel was positive for MCAD. Charlotte Hall was the daughter of Emily and Theodore Hall. After a year of trying to conceive, Charlotte was born on Thursday, April the 1st of 2021. The following Monday afternoon, the Halls welcomed friends and family into their home to meet Charlotte for the first time, and it was during this celebration that Charlotte suffered a metabolic crisis. She was rushed to the hospital, but did not survive her crisis. Devastated and emotionally drained, the Halls were detained by the police to be questioned about the death of their seemingly healthy newborn. There were no answers. After leaving the graveside service for Charlotte approximately 10 days after her birth, Heather looked at her phone to see that she had received a call from the UAB Metabolic Clinic. Charlotte was positive for MCAD. I don't come here before you today claiming to have a feasible, steadfast solution to this problem, but one day I will. Whether it's point of care testing for time-sensitive disorders like MCAD, an expedited courier service, additional state laboratories, prenatal genetic testing, we must find a solution to prevent the loss of lives and the devastation that these families have suffered. Days matter, Hours matter and minutes matter. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. And last, we'll hear from Mina Scavina.
Hello, thank you. And I have to say, I'm a little taken aback by all the stories. So thank you for those amazing and incredible presentations. I am a neurologist at Children's Health in Delaware, and also a certified care center program advisor with Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. I've cared for children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and their families for over 30 years. And I'm here today to advocate for the inclusion of Duchenne testing in the RUSP. I am not a parent, so I come here from the clinical aspect. As you know, Duchenne is a progressive and fatal neuromuscular disease. I have taken care of families with 2 or more boys with Duchenne. In large part, this is because there was no family history. And by the time the first or the second child was diagnosed, another child had been born and later diagnosed. Had Duchenne testing been included in the newborn screen for the first child, this would have provided the parents with invaluable information for family planning. And this has a ripple effect as well. Family members who are of childbearing age can be tested to determine if they are a carrier. In a recent paper published in the journal Neurology, the mean age at first parental concern for a group of boys with Duchenne was about 2.5 years of age. The mean age at genetic diagnosis was about 4.5 years of age. And the mean diagnostic delay was approximately 2 years. And this supports what we see in clinic and the need for early diagnosis. Another reason I feel strongly about the inclusion of Duchenne in the newborn screen is treatment. Until recently, treatment options were limited. However, available therapies now offer more options. Exon skipping therapy to increase the level of dystrophin in the muscle is now available. Steroids and cardiac medications are being started at a much younger age than when I began practicing. And the hope of effective gene therapy in the newborn period, as we've seen with SMA, is on the horizon. With the emergence of these and other therapies, early diagnosis and initiation of therapy is necessary to change the course and the burden of disease and improve quality of life. In addition to medical therapy, establishing a diagnosis early can lead to prompt referral to early intervention therapies such as speech, physical, and occupational therapy, which are critical in early childhood development. Until very recently, a state adjacent to our clinic did not include the testing for spinal muscular atrophy in their newborn screen. As a provider, I can say that not having that information readily available when evaluating a child for low muscle tone, weakness, delay, or regression of milestones required additional time and resources to carry out that genetic testing. That diagnostic odyssey can be extensive for families, and having that information early on allows providers to move more efficiently through their differential diagnosis in terms of time and the financial impact on the family and the medical system. Unnecessary testing can also be avoided. I've seen many young men come through with Duchenne who underwent liver biopsy. Liver enzymes are typically elevated secondary to the underlying muscle disease and elevation in the CK level. Boys are frequently referred to gastroenterologists and may undergo this liver biopsy only to find out that it is normal. And in fact, the cause is the Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So I'm here today to advocate for this inclusion. I look forward to a day when early diagnosis and treatment in Duchenne becomes a reality, as it is already for several other metabolic and neuromuscular diseases, and hopefully will be for those that were presented today, because it is quite heartbreaking to hear these stories. And I thank you for your time, and we look forward to your review of Duchenne nomination package in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your experience and information with the committee. We will now go ahead and take a break until 12:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We're ready to get started. For our last presentation of the meeting, The committee will hear about a preliminary analysis of the New Steps quality indicator data set on health equity in newborn screening. This will be presented by Sika Singh, who is the Deputy Director of the Newborn Screening and Genetics Program at the Association of Public Health Laboratories. Sika has expertise in developing and implementing strategic work plans, mentoring personnel, advancing key partnerships, and securing funds for nonprofit organizations. Sika has been a member of the American Society of Association Executives Diversity Executive Leadership Program, known as DELP, and was recognized as an Association Forum 40 Under 40 honoree in 2019. I'll now turn things over to Ms. Singh.
She'll be able to speak in just one moment.
Thank you.
Hi, apologies for that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that introduction and good afternoon. I'd like to thank the committee as well as you, Dr. Powell, for inviting APHL to present today, as well as the HRSA Maternal and Child Health Bureau for supporting New Steps. New Steps is the Newborn Screening Technical Assistance and Evaluation Program, and we are a program of the Association of Public Health Laboratories, and we serve as a national TA center for newborn screening laboratory and follow-up programs. One of the goals of New Steps is to provide a centralized website and data repository with the intent of performing data-driven outcome assessments. Data from the repository is what we use to inform this analysis and this presentation. Specifically, I'll be talking about what the data is showing us around health equity. This discussion and discussions like it are important because centuries of racism in this country have had profound and negative impacts on communities of color. And according to the CDC, as well as according to many bodies of research, these impacts are pervasive and deeply embedded in our society. Data show that ethnic and racial minority groups throughout the US experience higher rates of illness and death across a wide range of health conditions when compared to their white counterparts. Enduring health disparities are important to consider when establishing and strengthening public health and clinical programs. Next slide. So the data that we use in this analysis were cases entered into the New Steps data repository between 2011 and 2021. Next slide. And for the time period analyzed, New Steps contained just over 29,400 cases entered by 46 state newborn screening programs. And it's important to note that these data were not entered uniformly by all states across the decade in which we're reporting on. And this variation is because data entry into the New Steps data repository is voluntary, as well as because of the fact that states are required to enter into a memorandum of understanding with APHL prior to entering the data. And that happened at various time points over the past several years. Next slide. So of the 35 core disorders on the recommended uniform screening panel, 16 are classified as time critical conditions and 19 are classified as time sensitive conditions. Additionally, all of the secondary conditions are also classified as time sensitive. This classification, however, certainly does not speak to the clinical importance of the disorders or of timeliness writ large. For example, the characterization of CCHDs as not time critical does not mean that delays in detection and treatment of time-sensitive conditions would not be detrimental. So of the nearly 30,000 cases that we analyzed, 3,904 conditions were time critical and 25,500 were time sensitive. Next slide. So this slide shows the breakdown by race and ethnicity of the cases that we examined. There were 39 different race groupings reported, and about a third of the cases did not provide any race or ethnicity data. And what that tells us is that we need to figure out better ways of collecting that information. Next slide. So for the purpose of this discussion, we examined timeliness on only those cases that were detected by the initial specimen. Next slide. So that was 22,199 cases distributed across the states that you see here. Again, the case entry varied across years and by state. And if the case didn't indicate if the case did not indicate which screen identified the risk, then those cases were excluded from the analysis. Next slide. So we also excluded the cases with missing timeliness data, of course, from the analysis, as well as the outliers, which we defined as values of either 0 or having a z-score of 2.5. Next slide. And we condensed the timeliness data into 7 categories by race. Next slide. And across the board, we found that there were no significant differences by race in the timeliness buckets of birth to collection, birth to receipt by laboratory, and birth to reporting. We believe that this is because of the relative uniformity of newborn screening across the country as an opt-out program and a public health surveillance program. The differences, however, became more apparent in the buckets for median birth to diagnosis, as well as birth to intervention. And these can be seen in the bar graphs that you'll see on this, as well as on several subsequent slides. And the differences are quite visible where the differences exist. Next slide. However, we did perform statistical analyses to determine the significance of the differences. And we saw that there were categories that revealed significant differences between the reported racial categories. For example, timeliness for birth to diagnosis was significantly different in Black African American babies as compared to Native American, the not reported, the Asian, and white babies. And I want to note that the NS that you'll see on this slide and subsequent slides means that the relationship was not significant. The difference in the medians for time, in this case to birth to diagnosis, was not significant, meaning that they had a p-value of greater than 0.05. Next slide. So for birth to intervention across all race categories, we saw that there were significant differences between Black African American babies and all other races. Next slide. We then condensed the race categories with the intent of having that N be fairly uniform across the categories that we condensed. And we examined the timeliness by categories of white, other mixed, and not reported. And similarly, we saw significant differences in the birth to diagnosis and birth to intervention timeliness. And again, as expected in the birth to reporting and everything analytic, pre-analytic, there was a relative uniformity. Next slide. So what I just said about those significant differences across those 3 categories is also depicted here. And next slide. We then analyzed the data by time criticality of disorders. Next slide. So for time critical cases, we saw fewer significant differences in timeliness. Next slide. So for nearly all categories for birth to diagnosis, there was no significant difference. And then next slide, for birth to intervention, similarly to birth to diagnosis, there were fewer significant differences across racial categories for time elapsed between birth and intervention for time critical disorders. There may be a few reasons for this. So communication around urgent time critical disorders is strong. If a child needs to go to the ER, for example, that's a fairly straightforward directive. And there's less subjectivity or a chance for potential health system issues to come into play when the communication says, do this now, it's a life or death action. Additionally, the time critical conditions are relatively pan-ethnic, and there's no predominant race that is affected disproportionately by those 16 time critical diseases. And there isn't therefore a racial or ancestral component to these disorders. Next slide. So next we analyzed time-sensitive disorders by race. Next slide. And here we found that significant differences rose across racial categories again. So again, I want to bring your attention to the spark lines on the bottom of these sets of slides. And you can see that visible apparent difference. And there is, as I'll show in the following slides, still a statistical significance despite the ends in some cases being rather different. Next slide. So for birth to diagnosis, there were significant differences generally across all racial categories, with the exception of Islander, which had a very small N. And next slide. For birth to intervention for time-sensitive disorders, we again saw significant differences in timeliness between the Black African-American babies and all other race categories, and that's denoted by the asterisks across the bottommost row. Next slide. Finally, we performed some analyses stratified by specific disorders. Next slide. So cystic fibrosis is predominantly a disorder picked up in white babies with an N significantly higher than all other races. However, that's not to say that other races are not impacted by cystic fibrosis, but you'll see here that the N for white babies was 2,446 cases entered into the repository, and the remaining 6 racial categories are rather much smaller than that. Again, you'll see with the bar graphs on the bottom, there are significant differences that are being seen, and in the interquartile ranges, there are also significant changes in that spread of that data. Next slide. So what we found was that white babies were being diagnosed and receiving interventions days to weeks before Black babies, other mixed babies, and Asian babies. Next slide. Again, this slide is showing the same thing. This could be attributed to a number of things. For the diagnosis of CF, there might be misconceptions, like I talked about who might have cystic fibrosis, as well as issues around access. If there are only a few CF centers within a state, one might run into logistical and travel burdens that can then extend the time to achieving that intervention or even diagnosis. Next slide. So conversely, hemoglobinopathies are a disorder affecting mostly Black African-American babies. And so what we would have expected to see was that the diagnosis and intervention would be occurring more quickly for those babies, just like how with CF, the white babies realized diagnoses quicker. But that's not what we were seeing with the data here. So next slide. So we found no significant difference between Black and white babies for the time elapsed between birth and diagnosis. Next slide. Nor did we find a significant difference across race for time elapsed from birth to intervention for hemoglobinopathies. Again, we can't really be certain what to attribute this to. It could be communication or lack thereof about the urgency of this specific disease group and the impacts of people not getting into clinical care fast enough. And this just emphasizes the fact that ongoing education continues to be a necessary imperative. Next slide. Finally, we examined congenital hypothyroidism, which is pan-ethnic and it's not time critical. It often entails prolonged treatment process, and it requires going to several appointments and routine consultations with your PCP and so on. Next slide. So here we would have expected to see uniformity in diagnosis, but we see instead significant differences in time from birth to diagnosis between white, Black, Asian, and other mixed babies. And in the next slide, you'll see that we see similar differences in time to intervention. Next slide. So some limitations of what I just described was data completeness. Like I said, about a third of the cases were missing race and ethnicity data, and that's a significant number. And some states did not report the screen that identified the case, so we had to bring that number of cases that we analyzed from nearly 32,000 to just over 22,000. For data integrity and definitions, the origin of the reported base ethnicity data is unknown to us. It could come from the newborn screening kit, from the birth defects registry, from vital records, and likely from all of the above. We're also unclear whether the race ethnicity represents the baby or the mother. Fairly certain that it does not represent the father. And states are likely using differing definitions for diagnosis and intervention. And another limitation is race as a measure. We have to acknowledge that race is not a biological construct, it's a social construct, and self-reported race does not adequately characterize the lived experience, and it does not take into account impacts of socioeconomic status and geography and so on. Next slide. So some overall conclusions that we had was that there does appear to be variations in post-analytical timeliness correlated with reported race. And this was most notable in the time-sensitive conditions. We acknowledge that we need better race and ethnicity data for further analyses. We can't address what we can't assess. And that harmonized diagnosis and intervention date definition use amongst programs is also necessary to enable more robust comparisons. Next slide. And importantly, we want to thank several people, first and foremost, Amy Gaviglio, who performed these analyses and developed the content within this presentation. Would also like to thank Jalili Ojodu and Sari Edelman from APHL. Of course, HRSA, MCHB, and the New Steps Steering Committee for routinely providing feedback to us for any number of things, and most recently for the content within this presentation. And we want to acknowledge and thank the 53 US newborn screening programs that provide data to New Steps and that every day strengthen the system and serve the most vulnerable amongst us. And on the bottom of the slide, you'll see my contact information as well as contact information for New Steps. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn this over to questions or comments from our committee members first, and then organizational representatives. And as always, please unmute yourself and state your first and last name. Use the raised hand feature. Just give folks a minute. One question I had, are you able to separate out the cases based on whether they're from an urban home area versus rural area?
No, we don't have that level of information. We're only able to stratify to state.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, Robert Ostrander.
Hi there, Bob Ostrander from AAFP. And I'm really going to follow on what Dr. Powell just asked. You know, if we were doing medical research, trying to look at causality of things, we would be really aware up front of potentially confounding variables and try to tease those out with a number of different statistical and research means, you know, in other words, control for the other variables. I think before we draw big conclusions, and more importantly, you know, before as a society and an organization, we talk about actions to correct this, I think that really needs to happen for both socioeconomic and rural versus the rural versus urban variables. I mean, it undoubtedly, I mean, in my mind, I suspect a fair amount of what's driving this is socioeconomic, and the socioeconomic stuff may be based on systemic racism, but it's not systemic racism in the newborn screening programs and the healthcare delivery system per se. It's the systemic racism that causes the social disparities. And it would also be interesting, you know, to know if, you know, some of those socioeconomic and social determinant issues cut across racial lines, which would be my suspicion. I mean, I live in the middle of rural Western New York, where we do not have a lot of diversity of color, but we have a lot of diversity of socioeconomics. And I think if, you know, we took those same graphs and used the categories that we have here, I suspect we'd see very similar differences. And I think it's really important again, to statistically get rid of confounding variables in this sort of thing, and especially before anybody draws any giant conclusions.
No, that's a really good point, and thank you for sharing that. Certainly, I think we can acknowledge that there have been a wealth of studies conducted that do demonstrate that there are major social inequities and inherent inequities for the systemically excluded groups amongst us. And those can often be stratified by race. For this particular analysis, it's only a preliminary analysis, and it would be extremely helpful if we could link to vital records and get that additional layer of information that can help better inform what this data is telling us. So those points are very well taken. Thank you.
Natasha Bonham.
Natasha Bonham, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this information and this data. I think it's critical. So thank you so much, Sika, for presenting it, and Amy for doing the analysis, which I can't even begin to wrap my mind around. I have a couple of things. First, an easy question. Are you planning to publish this data in any way at any point, either with further analysis or anything else?
Yeah, we would really like to work closely with HRSA, with Amy and others who contributed to this analysis, and publish something. If not formally publish it, certainly get it out there for folks to be able to access and analyze.
Great. And then my next 3 points, I'll just go through. One is a question, and I don't know if this can be answered in this setting or just something to be thinking more about, what can be done to get the data that's needed to really be able to answer this. I know New Steps has now a long history of working with states and getting data, but it is still it's not a requirement that states provide this data, and actually capturing this data is very complicated. And that's not a newborn screening issue. That is a healthcare system issue. So that's one item. And another is, when we talk about time to intervention, I think it is really important, either through New Steps or through all the different partners, to really look at what is the delay to that. I think oftentimes when we talk about loss to follow-up or delay to intervention, and I don't think this is done necessarily purposefully, but or intentionally, that's the better way of saying it, but sometimes it kind of can end up seeming like we're blaming the families, like they don't know that this is important, or they don't know to come in, and it is still the responsibility of the system, I'm not saying just one group, but the system, to meet families where they are. And so I think that, and this isn't just a comment for this presentation, I think this is overall when we're talking about these issues, it's not just an education on families to know how important it is to keep their babies healthy and safe. They know that. They just may not know how to do that, or they may not have gotten the message of, and this is how to do that in this instance. And that may be more education on providers or other parts of the system. And lastly, to the comments that were just made, I agree, if we can get more data and understanding those confounding issues, that would be great. But and yes, socioeconomic plays a big role, but I think it's also important to know that that isn't everything. And we see that in maternal health, when we know that Black women who have a PhD and a six-figure salary are still having worse outcomes in pregnancy, including death, compared to white women who are in the Appalachian region. And that has been known for quite some time now. So yes, socioeconomics, but that isn't just it either. So again, thank you so much for this data and for us to be able to continue beyond today to have this discussion.
Yeah, of course, Natasha, those are really great points. A few responses. We think that one of the best ways to get more better data that can help refine these analyses would be by connecting to vital records and by making it easier for states to enter that data into the New Steps data repository, and also maybe benefiting from other HRSA-funded projects where information is collected, for example, about access to genetics, medical genetics resources stratified by zip code. I know that the National Coordinating Center is doing some of that work through ACMG. And then regarding meeting families where they are, this is definitely a priority. And I think that the global COVID pandemic also highlighted some of that, and there have been some activities and projects. I can speak to one out of DC where the newborn screening outreach folks are working to develop potentially mobile solutions to help bridge the gap between those access issues that have been exacerbated or brought to light due to the global pandemic. Certainly many of them had already been there prior to the pandemic. And then the early hearing detection program does a really great job of refining the causes of being lost to follow-up and determining whether it's because of insurance coverage, access, literacy, or other things. And that's a group that we can really learn from as well. And then target appropriately when a child does become lost to follow-up.
Scott Gross.
Scott Gross, CDC. Thank you, Sika. You mentioned insurance coverage. That was what I was going to ask you. Do you have any information on payer type in your survey?
No, in our database, we do not.
Because Medicaid, people in Medicaid, it's much harder to schedule follow-up visits than for people with other payer types because of lower reimbursement rates.
Yeah.
And so, and because there's a major difference in the racial ethnic composition of Medicaid populations, that could be an important confounder or mediating variable. Thank you.
Thanks.
Scott Schoen.
Thank you, Scott Schoen, committee members. So Sika, thank you so much. And I probably should know the answers to this for New Steps, but I wanted, if you could just clarify a couple things on the limitations. This is coming from case data, which is separate from the stats of just routine, sort of timeliness data, right? So on the case data, don't those separate entries have more clarity on race, ethnicity, or is it carried over? And the reason I ask is because I think we all know that what's on the card, any newborn screening program will say what's on the card is, I stop short of saying useless, but it's often observational. There's little solicitation of mom. And as you articulate, I think you said, is it mom or baby? So I think there's a lot of integrity around that question and how it's even combined on each card. Some states combine race and ethnicity onto one metric and some split it out. So first, can you just articulate a little bit on that? And because it gets to the question of how to better get the data. And I wanted you to then say, what's your vision of linking with vital stats? Is it, like Brendan from Texas, and I think Ashley from Washington presented on like a data Xanadu a long time ago, and they talked about these linkages. Is that what you're talking about, that grand, or something more simplistic to pull that? And then third is, can you just comment on the diagnosis and intervention date definition? Because I thought New Steps established those. So are you finding issues with programs maintaining use of those definitions?
Yeah, so great question. So we have 3 big sets of data that we collect within New Steps. We have the state profiles that tells us the fee for a newborn screening program, what disorders you're screening, your operating hours, so on, that public information. We then collect quality indicator information, and inherent within that is what we call quality indicator 5 on timeliness. That's aggregate data where we're looking at all of the specimens received and babies and the time that it took from birth to collection, birth to receipt at laboratory, birth to reporting results, and then birth to intervention and birth to confirmation of diagnosis. For those quality indicators, the term intervention and diagnosis is well defined. And acknowledging for those 35 disorders that we're collecting this information on, it could mean different things. It could be a phone call, it could be initiating medication, so on and so forth. However, where we got this data from was that third set of data that we collect, which is the case definitions, the cases. And the race and ethnicity data for that is populated from the dried blood spot card. And that speaks to the importance of connecting to vital records so that there's uniformity in that and there is no sort of opportunity for subjectivity, right? And then for the diagnosis and intervention for that case data, much of that information is coming back. There's a feedback loop to the newborn screening program from the clinical diagnosis. And that's where that breakdown, I don't want to say breakdown, but those differences happen in defining what a diagnosis is or defining what the intervention is, because that data is coming from the clinical setting back to the program. Is that helpful?
Let's see. Debbie Friedenberg, did you put your hand down or did you?
I did. Sorry, my question really had been related to the harmonization of the definition of time to intervention. And I think that that's already been answered, because I was a little bit concerned that one state might consider, let's say for MCAD, that initial telephone call saying, feed frequently is the intervention, whereas another state might count it as actually showing up in a physician's office. So, but I think that's been answered.
Okay. And Sabra Ankner?
Hi, Sabra Ankner from AMCHIP. I just wanted to just say one thing out loud, which is that not every program is reporting into this system, and not thoroughly. So I also want us to really consider that this is basically the best case scenario. That these are the programs that are actively working on timeliness in collaboration with APHL, that are choosing to take those steps, and the places that are collecting some amount of likely not entirely accurate race data and including it. So that, I think that in itself this is probably, if we really had data from all the programs, that it would be significantly worse, both in just overall timeliness, because it would be inclusive of the places that aren't actively working on this, as well as in the places that don't even have a way of looking at how they are performing on race and ethnicity data. So I want to thank APHL, Sika, Amy, the team for putting this together. And the other thing I want to say is I really want to encourage everybody to be comfortable with this being about racism. Like it's and I don't mean that to be okay with it, but I mean, there's not always another reason. As Natasha shared, there are plenty of data points in our health system and in our system in general that show that the factor is race when you exclude everything else. And there's not a reason to believe that the newborn screening system would be exclude itself from that somehow it would magically not be influenced by these things that we know impact maternal health outcomes and infant health outcomes, and all of these other things. Socioeconomic status, where you live, all of those things also impact, but race by itself and in and of itself consistently is a predictor of health outcomes. And I really, if we can't embrace that, if we can't accept it as a systems issue, then we can't address it.
Yeah, Sabra, that's really great points, well taken. For the 29,400 cases that we looked at over that decade of time, that data came from 46 states. So there's a fairly good amount of representation. However, not every state entered all the data for the entire decade and so on. And we certainly can't say that the states who didn't provide that data are not also working on timeliness or doing other things. So there is that spectrum, but definitely make good points. Thank you for sharing that.
Robert Ostrander.
Yeah, Bob Ostrander, AAFP. I wanted to make sure everybody was clear that I wasn't looking to explain away the role of race and what's going on, because it clearly wasn't the case. It's just a matter of when I'm thinking about things in terms of possible solutions, I really think of it like I would a medical problem, and knowing what the contributors are and what the magnitude of the contributors are helps to find the solution. And I think, that's kind of my pitch, is that we make sure we do that, because honestly, some of the non-directly racism as opposed to indirectly racism things may have a more direct solution and potentially might, in certain situations be playing a bigger role. So, I wouldn't ever want anybody to think my comments were, nor would I want this to deteriorate into a political discussion about whether folks were trying to deny the existence of racial disparities, even when all the other variables are controlled for. That's clearly the case. But I still think when you're looking to solve problems, you need to know what the magnitude of each contribution is when you're designing your solutions.
Thanks.
And I was just going to say, we didn't take it that way. Certainly the entire picture is very important. Race is not the only factor to consider, albeit it's a very important one, but thank you for sharing that.
And before we wrap up, I just wanted to see if Scott Gross could provide some additional information regarding the statement about Medicaid patients having a more difficult time to get follow-up. If he's still.
Yep. Yes.
Go ahead.
There was actually, multiple studies have documented this, but the most interesting are evaluations of the policy experiment as a result of the Affordable Care Act. In 2013 and 2014, Medicaid programs were required to reimburse at the same level as Medicare. Usually, most state Medicaid programs have substantially lower reimbursements than Medicare rates. And it becomes financially hard for clinics that have a lot of Medicaid patients. And so it's understandable why clinics might be more reluctant to schedule this. And what these studies have shown is that when Medicaid reimbursements were set equal to the Medicare rates, the number of people covered by Medicaid rose substantially.
So it's really that the providers are not wanting to take Medicaid patients because of the poor reimbursement.
I wouldn't say providers, I'd say it's an institutional, not the individual providers.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, Sean McCandless, do those data specifically address neonates or infants?
No,
or is it,
no, this is different age group.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit concerned about extrapolating from one age group to another, because certainly what we see locally is that the institutions that primarily provide care for adults have very different policies about accepting Medicaid patients than do the institutions that provide care for children and infants.
I think I do recall years ago, there was one study which looked specifically at the impact on children with special health care needs. I'll have to take that one out, share it with you, Sean.
Interesting. All right, well, Ms. Singh, thank you so much for your presentation today. Clearly, it's an area of great interest, and we look forward to hopefully updated data as you're able to acquire them in the future. All right, now we'll have a few minutes if there's new business, and I think Natasha Bonham had a couple of things she wanted to bring up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. First, I wanted to let the committee know that through Baby's First Test, we are convening a work group looking at newborn screening and CCMV. This is done in partnership with the CMV Foundation, and we are really happy that on that group we have about 30 people, 10 of which are representing 10 different states, and we will have though we've had numerous one-on-one conversations. We will have our first meeting in March, and really the purpose of this work group is really to build bridges between the CMV community and the newborn screening community and really discussing together key critical issues when thinking about implementation. If there's anything that comes out of that work group that would be of interest to this committee, we are happy to share that in any way that is appropriate and helpful. So I wanted to mention that. And secondly, I wanted to take the time to acknowledge the amazing work of Joan Scott, who is retiring. I feel very lucky that I met her at the very beginning of my career in this work and learned from her about focus groups and really getting public perspectives on genetics. That was during her time at the Genetics and Public Policy Center. But I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all of her work and effort in this space and to say thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. Joan Scott has already retired. Unfortunately, as far as I know, she wasn't able to join this meeting, but I certainly echo your sentiments, Natasha, and having known Joan since we were graduate students together, I have always been so impressed by all that she's done and accomplished, and thank her for all the help as I've served on this committee over the years. So thanks for acknowledging her. Anyone else with any new business? All right, hearing none. Our next meeting will be May 12th through 13th, and I am told, unfortunately, that's going to likely need to be another virtual meeting. But we look forward to getting together again. As noted earlier, we'll be putting together the work group to look at the possibility of prioritizing applications, and appreciate those who have contacted me already, stating your interest in doing that. We'll get back to you. And if nothing else, we'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you all.